half a year, longer than most people would have expected, including myself. So how and when will it ever end? On pro-Russian social media, you get the impression that Russia is winning, that they're steadily making progress, and it's only a matter of time until victory. On pro-Ukrainian and Western social media, it's the exact opposite. You get the sense that Ukraine has turned the tide of the war, that they'll soon be retaking lost territory, and that it's only a matter of time before Russia will be defeated. And it's hard to know which one, if either, is true. The stories and events that get viewed and shared the most, and therefore shape people's view of the war, are the large strikes or footage of tanks and vehicles getting destroyed. But in the overall picture, these are not as important or decisive as they seem. A single successful Russian operation, or a HIMARS strike for example, can boost morale temporarily, but for 99% of troops on the front line, the reality is, not much changes. It's still a constant, slow, daily grind, with attrition decreasing equipment and vehicle numbers, manpower, and overall morale after days, weeks, and now months. Then there's also how long the public will continue to support the war effort, and that's on both sides and internationally. It's pretty easy to do so at first, but as time goes on, the financial costs and interruptions to daily life begin to take a toll. So, is Ukraine winning? And can they win the overall war in the end? But first, real quick, this video's sponsor, MyHeritage. They are the leading global service for family history research and DNA testing. It's pretty fun to check out their more than 18 billion records. With it, you can build up your family tree and discover your ancestors. I found my mom's side is a little bit boring. They all came from Sweden about 100 years ago. But my dad's side had lived all across the country, from Massachusetts, California, to Texas, Ohio, and more. But with just a little bit of information I put in, it brought me all the way back to my great-great-great-grandfather, born in 1782. So even if you don't know much about your family history, MyHeritage can find dozens of matches, and possibly even going back centuries. They also have DNA tests, allowing you to uncover your ethnic origins and find new relatives. Further, you can enhance, colorize, and repair photos automatically, like this one from my grandparents' wedding. MyHeritage is a great service, and it's trusted by more than 90 million users. So go and check it out. Sign up for the 14-day free trial and enjoy all the amazing features MyHeritage has to offer. If you decide to continue your subscription, you'll then get a 50% discount. So go, click the link down in the description. Again, MyHeritage. Now obviously, a quick note, the concept of winning is complex and it can be defined a million different ways. But one of the most straightforward might be in territory controlled. Russia has taken over a sizable percentage of Ukraine's pre-war territory. As of the 2nd of September, it holds about 15.6% of the land. That's not including water, or Crimea, or the breakaway regions. With that one figure alone, it could be simple to say that Russia is currently winning. They hold Ukrainian territory that Ukraine has not been able to take back yet, let alone recover Crimea or again those breakaway regions. However, most of the currently Russian-controlled territory was taken early on in the war. Progress has slowed dramatically since. These numbers here are not perfect as it's based on my own animated map, but they're close enough to see the trends. But you can see here that there's hardly any increase after the first 2 months. More importantly though is more recent. Here's the gains and losses over the last 4 months. The large spike here was when Russia finally captured Severodonetsk and the surrounding area, as well as some other regions, and then the dip recently with Ukraine's push in the south near Kherson. So progress for Russia is slow. On average over this time frame, they're gaining about 53 square kilometers a day. At that rate, it would take over 23 years for them to take the entire country. And we've seen Russia begin offering massive incentives and bonuses to get people to fight for them in Ukraine. So it shows they're having manpower problems, which could explain the lack of progress and setbacks they're facing. There seems to be two options for Russia: either massively escalate by pouring in more resources and manpower, or attempting to negotiate a ceasefire. A ceasefire that includes Russia being able to keep its gains is looking less and less likely. They would have been in a much better negotiating position had they held the territory they seized around Kyiv. They could have then offered a withdrawal in the north in exchange for Donbass and part of the south. But now Ukraine has been able to better hold off Russian advances, and things like HIMARS gives them hope that they could win through attrition, and that Russia might eventually withdraw. So the other option is a massive surge. Russia is already committing most of the forces it can spare. The 1 million number you might see is deceptive. That's including their navy, air force, air defenses defending the country, space forces, their nuclear forces, and so on. Their ground forces only consist of roughly 250,000 personnel, more than half of which are already involved in the war effort in some way. Personnel also have to be rotated as time goes on, and they also need troops at home to defend the Russian borders, staff military bases abroad, and conduct basic duties at home. The solution to this would be mobilization. That would give them the ability to call up over 1 million personnel to fight, and switch to a wartime economy to commit to winning the war. The problem is, Russia refuses to admit it's even in a war. As you probably know, they call it a special military operation. Calling it a war and mobilizing reserves and conscripts, therefore, is basically admitting that their operation has failed, despite the constant reassurances it's given its people that they're winning and everything is going according to plan. That's not going to be very popular domestically, unless they can come up with some sort of good justification for why it's now necessary. Even a partial mobilization could come at great political costs. Ukraine, on the other hand, ordered a full mobilization the day Russia invaded, so it's already tapping into its reserves. One chance for Russia winning is that Ukraine will eventually exhaust its own available manpower and their lines will collapse. Whether and when this will happen is difficult to predict. Ukraine's mobilization says that every male between the ages of 18 to 60 can be called upon into service. That's nearly 12 million people, but realistic numbers fit for service are much lower. During World War II in the US, the selective service had about 50 million eligible men, of which 20 million were selected, and half of that, or 10 million, were inducted. Also, again, Ukraine includes up to age 60. On average, the older means higher rates of being unfit for medical reasons. We could take a more realistic number of 20% of the men up to age 50, and that comes out to 1.9 million. Then there's also the issue of having all the resources and logistics to train, equip, house, and feed them all. There's no exact figure, but it's estimated around 200 to 500,000 are already in the fight. Then if we take estimated recent casualty rates, and the need to rotate personnel to keep them fresh and efficient, if they can properly train and equip that number, they can keep up their current strength for another 28 months. That number has a wide margin of error though. Also, those drafted would be less experienced and therefore less effective, so casualty rates could be much higher. Then also any changes in the course of the war can drastically affect that figure. For example, attempts at counteroffensives. On the 29th of August, Ukraine began its counteroffensive in Kherson that's been talked about for months. It's still ongoing, so reliable information is hard to come by, but they appeared to push along several locations. The advances were pretty standard. Large rocket and artillery strikes to soften up enemy positions, followed by tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and then infantry on foot. Russia was then quick to state that they responded and then stopped all Ukrainian advances with superior firepower and that it's ended. However, not long after, many pro-Russian sources began stating that this was not the case, and that at least one prong had been successful. Honestly, right now, we just don't know how this offensive is going, but likely it's not going as well as Ukraine hoped. NASA's firms can maybe give us some clue, as it does show some increased fires in the area, but this is not much more than previous weeks. And again, as always, it needs to be noted that every dot doesn't necessarily mean a fire from battle, and every fire won't necessarily be detected and marked. So without any more information, the success or failure of this counteroffensive will come down to how many forces Ukraine can commit to the fight. Offensives are much more difficult than defending. You're out in the open and exposed to enemy drones, which will notify artillery and air support to come after you and stop you. So not only do you need tanks and IFVs and infantry, but you also need air defense to provide cover overhead and counter battery fire to stop enemy artillery. So it requires a lot, and there's often heavy losses along the way, which all need to be replaced to keep up your strength. Whether Ukraine has the manpower available to commit is also unknown, as they still need to hold up the front lines across the rest of the country as well. Taking Kherson is one thing, but where it would go from there is more tricky. The many strikes on the main bridge over the river that helped limit Russian troop movements will also limit Ukraine's ability to push further south, and any push south would require a lot more forces in the current offensive, which doesn't seem likely anytime soon, especially with winter approaching. There are other areas Ukraine could have success, such as south into Melitopol, but it becomes somewhat more tricky due to its distance from the front, and also being exposed to counterattack on your left and right flanks. Also, the geography makes it difficult to hold. Like the region between Mykolaiv and Kherson, it's very flat, open farmland, providing very little cover. So even if Ukraine succeeds in Kherson, future options for counteroffensives are more difficult and will require a lot more manpower, equipment, and time. But the more likely scenario, in the standpoint of Ukraine winning, is Russia exhausting its own forces and/or the war becoming too costly to continue. Ukraine seems determined to push Russia out, so as long as the West keeps supplying weapons, it's going to continue to strike Russian bases, ammo dumps, vehicles, etc. And eventually, the price of continuing to hold these territories indefinitely becomes too high and they withdraw. This is similar in a way to the US and Afghanistan, as well as the Soviet Union and Afghanistan back in the 1980s. Both won virtually every battle they fought, but after years of slow but steady attacks, it was clear that they were never going to fully defeat such a determined enemy, and both eventually withdrew. If Russia did withdraw, the interesting question would be what would they withdraw from? The newly captured territory is obvious, but what about giving back control of Crimea? That seems less likely, or the breakaway regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. The administration there has been in control for 8 years now, allowing it to further consolidate its power. And it's true that there's a large percentage of ethnic Russians and Russians that have moved there since that would be less accepting of Ukrainian control again. So, is Ukraine winning? There is no honest or credible straight answer. Russia has seized a lot of territory and is continuing to do so on average each week. So on one hand, you can say that Russia is currently winning, but that rate has decreased substantially, and Ukraine has even began large counteroffensives. It seems it's likely going to come down to Russia's commitment to fighting the war. They almost certainly can't keep offering huge cash payouts to veterans and others to go fight for them indefinitely. So will they be willing to accept the political blowback and admitting that their peacetime army has failed and they need to mobilize? Then there's also the factor of Russia's cost in international relations and global trade as the war goes on. While it's difficult to see Russia being able to completely defeat Ukraine so it's no longer a threat, it's also hard to imagine Russia losing face and withdrawing. The Soviet Union's war and then subsequent withdrawal from Afghanistan likely played at least some role in their collapse just a few years later. So it seems the most likely outcome will either be a mobilization and take the political fallout, or negotiate some sort of ceasefire, which Russia will probably have to give up most, if not all of its gains in the war. In that scenario, you can see Russia attempt to spin it and save face by claiming that it just wanted to teach Ukraine a lesson, and that it was no longer a threat to them. But making predictions is next to impossible in war. If it wasn't, then there wouldn't have been so many failed offensive wars over the years. There's a million variables to factor in, and a million more hidden ones that can never be known. Anything could happen. Russia could collapse, Ukraine could suffer a major defeat it can't recover from, or an economic or political crisis in the West could occur that limits their ability to support Ukraine, or aliens could come down to Earth and change the course of history.